Hi, Be Health Empowered family. Welcome back to another week of Excuse Me, Doctor. And I have to say happy spring because we are in the springtime. And, no matter what season it is, we are here each and every week bringing you facts, figures, and science so you can make informed health decisions for yourself, your family, and even your community. And now, we don't deal in speculation or misinformation. We actually debunk it each and every week. We are streaming live on YouTube and Facebook. And welcome to my newbies who are joining for the first time. Remember that you can like it on Facebook and please subscribe if you're watching us on YouTube. And the other thing is we really want you all to be asking your questions, because that's why we're here, to answer your questions. The name of the show is Excuse Me, Doctor. It's so that you can be empowered to ask questions and get the answers that you need. So without any further ado, I am going to bring in my wonderful co-producers, Miss Lila Mays, coming to us from the West Coast. Hey, Lila.
Hey,
and Mr. Wayne Bruce, right here on the East Coast.
How's everybody? Everybody good?
We are great.
Yeah. All right. There we go.
Fantastic.
Can everybody in radio land, TV land hear me tonight? Type in type in the comments if you can hear me or not. Hi, Belinda.
I think I can definitely hear you, and I think we need to hit that recap.
Let's hit the recap.
Okay.
Lila?
We're ready, Dr. Mel? So, as we usually do, we start with the numbers. So, Dr. Mel, where are we in terms of cases this week?
So, we are actually at just under 31 million cases of COVID. We're still leading the world. And we're about to go into another surge. I mean, we're at 57,000 cases a day, which is almost 10% more than last week. And even in the face of this, a bunch of states are still opening up, rolling back mask mandates, opening bars and restaurants. We're still seeing the people on spring break. And then on top of all of that, people are tired of being at home. They're traveling for spring break, even if they're not vaccinated. So I'm afraid we're about to take off again. I really am.
Wow. So that's the number of cases. How are we in terms of people expiring? What is the death toll at this point?
Unfortunately, we're up to 562,000, a little bit over that. But we are actually, deaths lag behind cases. So the death rate is dropping. Even as we're about to go up in cases, we're down 22% from last week. So that's actually good news.
All right, that's a win. Okay, so death cases are dropping. So your girl is fully vaccinated I got my second dose yesterday. What are we looking like? What are we looking like in terms of vaccinations, Dr. Mel?
And I must say, you're looking very perky the day after vaccination, so that's wonderful.
Why, thank you.
Yes. Well, we are on a roll. 2.5 million doses being given out every single day. 14% of the United States population is vaccinated. That's like 52 million people fully vaccinated, both doses. We still have about 2 or 3 million people who've gotten the J&J, which is just the one shot. And there's some states that are at the head of the class. We have Wisconsin, New Mexico, and North Dakota, all, excelling. And then we got those little laggards bringing up the rear, Alabama and Georgia. They're the worst in terms of vaccination rates the second week running. So we'll send some prayers down to our people down there.
The worst.
Yeah, the worst they are. So, Dr. Mel, how about this? Watching CNN this weekend, and they had the round table of the doctors, like a behind the scenes of, as Sanjay Gupta put it, the what did he put it? The autopsy for this whole pandemic. And so they kind of was people have asked this question also. Where did coronavirus come from?
So yeah, I was glued to that. And I figured I'd talk about it just in case folks didn't miss it. One thing that was really key, other than where did it come from, was that, we've thought that this started in December, but what the WHO actually showed is that there were several strains of the coronavirus already circulating in Wuhan by December, which means that in order for that to happen, the original strain got into the population at minimum early fall. So it's not like this started immediately in December. And then we heard that Dr. Redfield, the former head of the CDC, said he believes that the origin of the virus was from a lab in Wuhan because they do research on viruses there in Wuhan. And he thinks that that's the case. It's just his opinion, very important, and that he doesn't think it was on purpose. But the reason he thinks that this might be true is because of how infectious it was seemingly off the bat.
Okay.
Now, because when viruses jump species from animal to human, they're generally not infectious immediately to humans. Wow. Now, Dr. Fauci and WHO disagree with him. They clearly think that it went back and forth in nature between humans and animals for a while, under the radar for several months before it surfaced as the virus that we know now. So their explanation for why it was sort of fully formed when we found it was because it was circulating under the radar for a while. But as I say, and I've said from the beginning, it kind of doesn't matter at this point where it came from, because we really need to be focusing all our attention on fighting it.
Indeed. So, Dr. Mayo, we have a few vaccines that are already at the party. They've been at the party for a minute now, right? We have Pfizer, and J&J is in the party now, and Moderna. They started the party, but that cool cousin AstraZeneca can't seem to get it together. What is going on with AstraZeneca?
Right, and I'm cracking up because of that video of the brother dressed up as different vaccines that's circulating on social media, and they talk about AstraZeneca with the cool name. But that's the only thing so far that's cool about AstraZeneca, because they just seem to be shooting themselves in the foot. I mean, first it was, there was a concern about it having neurologic symptoms in the trial, and so the trial had to be stopped, and it was researched and deemed that those neurologic symptoms were not related to the vaccine. Oh. But then South Africa, you didn't know that. Yes, that was the upshot of the investigation. But then South Africa stopped giving it, the AstraZeneca vaccine, in favor of the J&J because they didn't think it was strong enough against the South African variant. And then the EU stopped it because they're concerned about blood clots. That's still under investigation. And then now here we are in the United States, and they released this press release with outdated data. When they updated it, it wasn't that great of a change, but initially they said that their vaccine was 79% effective. Then they had to revise it down to 76% effective with the updated data. Both times, though, and this is important, they said that it was 100% effective against severe disease. Now, we have not actually seen this data to review it. This was just a press release. But, we're going to find out pretty soon, because they're going to be applying for emergency use authorization here in the United States. But I hope all these missteps that they've had don't erode public confidence in the vaccine if the FDA does indeed authorize it.
Yeah, that's tough.
Yeah. So is it, Lila, is it that cousin who just comes and stays on your sofa and freeloads? Could AstraZeneca be that vaccine cousin?
We hope not.
No, you're right. We hope not. We hope it's that cousin that brings that good old 7-Up cake and cups and plates
clean your house while they're there.
How you been, Astra?
Yeah, but they're not showing up like that. Yeah, we'll see. So Dr. Mayo, I feel like this might be a bright spot, but let's talk about cases in nursing homes, which is a hot topic for us, producer and host.
Yeah, we all have loved ones in long-term care, either assisted living, But yeah, COVID cases and deaths have both plummeted in nursing homes in the first 2 months of 2021. Remember, they were the first group of people to get the vaccine. So we think that this partially at least has something to do with the vaccine. Of course, social distancing and mask wearing and all the things that these long-term care facilities have been doing have something to do with it. But it's not a coincidence, I think, that the timing of it relates to when they started getting vaccinated. The big problem remains, though, a lot of long-term care workers are still hesitant about getting the vaccine. So we'll have to keep an eye on that.
Okay.
Wow. So look, we had this big announcement plan about May Day, about May 1st, 2021, but you actually have breaking news.
Yeah. Well, the May Day thing is still legit. So May 1st is when just about every state will have COVID vaccines available for 16-year-old individuals and above. 6 states have it now. So my 17 and 18-year-old nieces just got vaccinated in Georgia. Yay.
Nice.
And yep. And then all the other states will have it sometime between now and May 1st. The breaking news, though, is that 90% of individuals will be eligible by April 19th. So it seems like that May date may be moved up to April 19th. And also President Biden announced that everybody will be within 5 miles of a vaccination site. And that's because he's going to be making sure that more and more pharmacies have vaccinations available for folks. So that is good news.
That's good news. Yeah, that's great news.
So speaking of news and good news and great news, let's go to some fake news.
Okay.
All right.
Let it go.
Because it's time for what?
The weekly debunk.
Stopping misinformation in the tracks.
Girl Bye said, I heard that Bill Gates funded the vaccine. It's a quantum dot tattoo that is scannable via the artificial enzyme luciferase. The vaccine chip is to contain your medical records, your vaccine records, and a digitized world currency.
I don't know about that. Excuse me, Dr. Mel. Is that true?
So that might seem really outlandish to you all, but believe it or not, that exact tweet was shared 832 times. So there are people who really do believe that that's true, but it is not a thing. Repeat, it is not a thing. First of all, in this scenario, is the vaccine a tattoo or is it a chip? First of all. Secondly, where do these words like luciferase come from? It sounds like they took the name of the devil and stuck the term, right, Lucifer, and stuck the ending ace on it, which is typically the name that you hear on the end of an enzyme, like, you know, an enzyme in your body. So it makes it sound very scientific and official, but there is no such thing as luciferase. And then Bill Gates, he always gets dragged into this, and it's not clear what his motivation is in doing this. What we do know is that his foundation has had a very positive track record in decreasing deaths from childhood diseases in developing countries. And as I've pointed out before, he keeps getting linked to depopulation. Well, the reason why, and there's a quote where he talks about, controlling population growth, it's because when fewer children die in a family because of infectious childhood diseases like malaria, for example, families choose to have fewer children because they're assured that their children will reach adulthood. And therefore, that makes the quality of life for that family better because they have more resources to be able to give to the children that they do choose to have. They're not having them just sort of playing the luck of the draw. That happened here in the United States. That's why family sizes decreased in the United States because of vaccination. So the other thing is, if this were true, everybody worldwide would have to be in on it. So, this chip thing, governments, the FDA and their equivalents in all countries, so all the scientists that worked on this worldwide and all the labs, the companies that manufacture it. And I say, in this whistleblower culture where everybody has a platform, don't you think somebody with definitive proof would have come out if that was actually the case, that this thing has a chip in it? And then the other thing is, if you're really curious and you want to know what's in the vaccine, it's there for all the world to see on the FDA's website. It's basically the virus material to make the spike protein so that your immune system recognizes the spike protein when it's manufactured by your body, as facilitated by the vaccine. And then there has to be something to help protect that genetic material of the virus as it enters your body. So there's a little casing that's made of fat, salts, and sugars that just kind of hold it together and protects it as it enters your body and gets to your cells. And when it gets to your cells, it gets taken in. The genetic material instructions get delivered to the cell. And then that all gets destroyed as soon as those instructions are delivered. So there's no chance for it to stay around in your body and be used as a chip and with all this stuff going on. And then finally, we already have tracking devices. They're called our cell phones. And yeah, we don't really need any additional tracking devices. So that's the debunk. What we just heard, that's not true.
Wow.
Dr. Bell.
I don't have a tattoo, and I thought I got one the easy way. Thank you, Dr. Mel.
You are welcome. And thank you all for bringing the recap and the debunk to us. And I want to remind everyone, please put in your questions in the chat, because we are about to go into our show topic for tonight, which is navigating a hospital stay in this time of COVID. You know, I wrote a book called Excuse Me, Doctor, I've Got What? And in it, I have a whole chapter about navigating a hospital stay and all the things that you need to do. And at the end of every chapter in the book, there's like a checklist that you can follow. But I wrote it before COVID-19, and there's some really important changes that have happened, whether you get admitted to the hospital for COVID-19 or otherwise, that you need to know. And, you know, we're going to cover a lot tonight because we have two really incredible guests. My first guest is Nurse Meadie Bardinelli. She's a trained cardiac ICU nurse and a nursing leader. She serves as the chair of the Washington, D.C. Board of Nursing, and she was appointed by the mayor of Washington, D.C. as one of 3 members of the 15th Electoral College of the District of Columbia. I think that's so cool. She's also an active member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, a public service organization, which makes her one of my dear sorors. Welcome, Nurse Meadie.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mel. Thank you for allowing me to be on your show. And as a nurse, I get to say, excuse me, doctor, what did you just order? So I'm excited to be here with you tonight. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I am excited to have you. And our next guest is Mrs. Sharon Irby Randall. She's a married great-grandmother and community leader. She's retired from the corporate world, but she is still working as the board vice president at Lindsay Park, which is a 2,000-unit co-op in Brooklyn, New York. She negotiates with political leaders, corporations, contractors, all to make sure that her community has the best quality of life. Her husband, Thurston, unfortunately had COVID last year. He was actually a guest on Excuse Me, Doctor. But now she's going to join us to talk about how she advocated for him through his recovery. Thanks so much for joining me.
Hi, Dr. Mel. Thank you so much for having me this evening. I'm really happy to be here and hope that I can shed some light to help others, you know, unfortunately, if they enter into the hospital system with COVID. But I'm very pleased to be here, and I hope that what I'm able to share will be able to help someone tonight. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for being here, Sharon. And I'm going to jump right into it with Nurse Meadie. So a patient gets admitted to the hospital and ends up on your ward. What are some of the first things you do as a nurse to make sure they get settled in? And what role does the family play in that?
I think she is muted.
Nurse. So we're going to pick right back up until we get our guests back on. And we are talking about how to survive a hospital stay. One of the things that I talk about in Excuse Me Doctor is just the concept that the squeaky wheel gets the most oil. And what that means is when you're in the hospital, if there's someone who is advocating for you, don't be afraid to ask the nurses and ask the doctors for what you need. And, you don't have to be obnoxious about it, but, they tend to get pulled in 1,000 different directions, unfortunately. And sometimes you have to remind them, if you've asked them once and your needs haven't been met, to just make sure that you kind of keep it top of mind. And our guests are back. Wonderful. So, Nurse Meaty, I was just talking about the squeaky wheel gets the most oil, but before we get to that, I was asking you, when a patient gets admitted to the hospital and ends up on your ward, what are the first things that a nurse does to make sure that they get settled in? And what is the role that the family plays in that process?
Great question, Dr. Mel. And as I was alluding to before we dropped off, is that I do just want to take 5 seconds for those of you who know me, know where I work. I am not here as an agent of that organization. This is Meaty Bartinelli sharing with Dr. Mel and her wonderful audience tonight. Just that little disclaimer. But the first thing that we do, Dr. Mel, as you are well aware of, is that we first orient the patient to the unit, to what's happening, make sure they understand their actual diagnosis and what we call the POC, which is a plan of care. We utilize a big whiteboard, letting them know how to contact us and how to reach us. And as you all know, all of this has been completely stopped and assisted where that can't happen anymore because of COVID. So we no longer have other family members that typically are able to be there to understand what is going on with their family members. And keep in mind, most times when you're in a hospital, you're not feeling well. So you're half listening, you're sick, you're tired, you're sleepy. You probably had, 4 up to 12 hours, if not longer at minimum, in the emergency department before you actually have been admitted to the unit. And so the first thing is kind of a reorientation to that process. The family plays such an integral role because, as I just alluded to, most times you're not feeling well and you really need that advocate. You need someone to, quite frankly, interpret, as your book says, excuse me, doctor, what did you just say? Because you're not feeling well. So you need that other individual who's able to write down and understand the medical jargon, as we call it in the hospital, to really make sure you can understand what the plan is for you. And also the most important thing is getting a medical history. And so I'm married. And so my husband knows any surgeries that I've had. He knows any medications that I've taken. And so once you come to the hospital, if you're not feeling well, sometimes you forget that. And that's why it's so important to have family members there that can help advocate for you on your behalf.
Yeah. And it's so important that if you do have a history of surgeries and medications, etc., that you have it written down, because your family member may be stressed, too stressed to remember it. So that actually brings me to Sharon. So when Thurston got admitted to the hospital, kind of walk us through that process. How did you know that he had COVID? And how is it that he ended up in the hospital? And what was that whole process like, since you couldn't physically be there for all of it?
Right. It was early on in 2020 in March when he contracted COVID, and there weren't a lot of information that was available. But early in the week, his blood pressure went up, and then shortly thereafter, he became nauseous. So we thought it was a stomach virus. So after a couple of days of high blood pressure, and which he doesn't have high blood pressure, I do. So we used my monitor to check and see, was it going down? What was the reason for this? And eventually we contacted the emergency service that's in our neighborhood. It's like a
Urgent care.
Urgent care, exactly. So we were able to arrange actually a virtual, excuse me, a telecare. We wanted to find out from them if he didn't have to go out in order to get care, if we could do it through telecare. And she prescribed antibiotics for him because she thought it was just, a stomach virus. But shortly
Which is not
thereafter,
surprising given that it was March. Yeah, it was pretty early on in the pandemic. Yeah.
Very early on, like perhaps a couple of days after it was officially announced that it was a state of emergency here in the United States. So that was about March, maybe 14th or 15th.
Yeah. So how did he actually get diagnosed?
Well, actually, we kept checking because we were, we're avid watchers of CNN and, reading and just listening to all the information that was being circulated. He actually went on a website and was checking his symptoms. This was Friday. So, and he came through the house and I was in the bedroom and he said, okay, I just checked all these symptoms for COVID. And I think that I have the virus. And that was a real deafening moment for us. We really had to, my heart almost jumped out of my chest. I was afraid. We didn't know what to do. There weren't many services available. No one was testing. There was no vaccine. We didn't know what hospitals were able to do. We were hearing that, people were dying, in China and other countries. But we called a family doctor of ours. She's a doctor at Methodist Hospital, and we explained the symptoms, and we tried to get information from the government. So we called to find out, like, where could we get tested? At first, they gave us misinformation. They said, oh, someone's going to come to the house. So we waited. We waited another week. Yeah, and by then, he was really getting sick. And we called a family friend, and she told us, if in fact his symptoms, he wasn't coughing, if in fact he has difficulty breathing, you need to go to the emergency ASAP. Just call 911 and go.
Yeah, let's fast forward to when he actually entered the hospital. What was that like? Because I'm pretty sure you couldn't be there with him.
Yeah, no, I couldn't. That was a terrible Sunday when my brother-in-law called his brother, and Thurston was having difficulty. He was having tightness in his chest. And when he spoke to his brother and he said, I'm having this tightness. So he called the doctor, Dr. Leslie, and she said, he needs to go to emergency now. We called 911. And he said, leave the door open. EMS came in. They wanted to take him to the neighborhood hospital. I said, no way. We're going to a different hospital. And that's the hospital that Dr. Leslie was at.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point that, it was actually shown in New York that what hospital you got admitted to actually really did correlate with your outcomes.
Survival.
And a lot of people, and a lot of people don't know that you can actually go on a website called Medicare.gov and you can look up the rating systems of the various hospitals so that you can see which hospitals, rate more highly. So Meaty, I did mention before that the squeaky wheel gets the most oil. Sharon clearly is very very knowledgeable, right, in terms of advocating for herself and her husband. What are some of the things that you see that may fall through the cracks if a family is not knowledgeable like Sharon and Thurston in terms of advocating for themselves?
Great question. And the first response really goes back to my initial comment to you about really not understanding onset of symptoms, not understanding how you felt. You know, at this point, every day feels like Monday, right? And so it's like, well, when did this really happen? And it's so integral to understand that when we were first dealing with COVID, onset of symptoms was so key for the physicians and healthcare providers to really determine what type of treatment that you need, to determine how long you have been infected, how long and whom, before we had what we now, it's a household term of contact tracing, before we were able to understand that. And so really having that, that family person there to advocate and to share, really for the physicians to lead the plan of care. Other thing that I would like to add to that is the squeaky wheel gets the oil. So, you know, Sharon gave a really, really, really great example of not saying anything bad about that community hospital. But obviously, if her husband started to become fairly symptomatic and she knew that, you know, one hospital only had, you know, a small set of ICU beds and ventilators versus another facility that, you know, has a much more robust opportunity to care for those type of patients, like a level 1 trauma center, you know, the helicopter pad, you know, the renowned surgeons or whatever it is that you're looking for. It's no different from, you know, getting a car, right? Are you going to go to the local car lot down the street, or are you going to go to the actual, you know, Benz dealership if that's what you're looking for? And so I think really understanding that healthcare also is consumer driven.
Yeah.
So you also have to understand, again, you get what you pay for. In this context, you get what you advocate for, because ultimately, if you are insured and or uninsured and or underinsured, which is, I think the majority of us, quite frankly, are underinsured, it's so important to understand where do you go to get your treatment can have definitely impact your outcomes.
But when I was actually specifically asking about when someone ends up in the hospital, if there's not someone there to advocate for them, what kinds of things might slip through the cracks, so to speak? If there's not an involved family member, like Sharon is clearly an involved family member.
That could be the difference, Dr. Mel, of getting a X-ray versus getting a CAT scan or MRI. That could be the difference of ensuring that physical therapy has actually come and worked and monitored your family member versus, oh, the nurse or the tech just got them up and they sat in the chair all day, versus having a complete evaluation by a multidisciplinary team. That could be the difference of speaking to social work and the case management, in her case, you know, when her husband was getting ready to be discharged, which facility versus here's the one that we picked for you and just go. There are certain guidelines that most hospitals, obviously, that we should abide and adhere to, but we all know that we're human. And quite frankly, early on, everyone was scared, right? Myself included. We didn't want to be in hospital. So we just wanted to do, you know, treat and street, as I call it, right? Do the best we can and get them to their next, wherever that next would be, whether it be home or back to the ICU or back to a rehab facility. And so at that time, I think there's a myriad of things that could be missed. But number one, I just think simple treatments and asking questions, and quite frankly, early on, pushing to not take people off of ventilators quickly and wait to see. That I think that, quite frankly, as it relates specifically to COVID, is one of the number one things. When you think about understanding one's comorbidity and their expected outcome post this, I think there's a lot more tolerance for letting people stay on the ventilators a little bit longer now than we did early on, because we weren't quite sure. So that was a big.
Yeah, definitely. I think we understand more about the ventilator settings and how to manage the ventilator with people with COVID, which we didn't know back when Thurston was originally admitted. So Sharon, how can you, other than choosing the right hospital, which I take my hat off to you for doing, how else do you think your involvement when he was in the hospital, what were you able to influence?
Well, one of the things that we were sure to do before he left, I stuffed his phone and his charger in his pocket so that we could stay in contact. I got a telephone number once we got to the hospital to find out who could I be in contact with to find out what his condition was, because when he left, he was having really difficulty in breathing. I also I got all the telephone numbers for the the nurses' stations and what floors and emergency to see if I could locate him if he wasn't able to speak. I found out who his doctor was. He had a really brilliant pulmonary doctor, Dr. Sela. His team, we found out who his team was. I got his stats every day. I text that to the family. I kept them involved. I contacted my church. I'm on the altar ministry for Brooklyn Tabernacle Church, and just want to give a shout out to them because we prayed, and every day we prayed together, my husband and I. Every day we did praise and worship in the morning and in the evening. But when they brought him home, he was on oxygen. I made sure I contacted the company to make sure that I knew exactly what to do with that oxygen tank, because I'd never had any experience whatsoever with the oxygen
I was just going to
tank.
say, you have no medical background, right?
None.
Right.
And
I think she's gonna work for me. Lord, she's doing a great job.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love him. So I mean, it's like it's your loved one. I love him, and I knew this had to do with life or death. My decision and me taking the reins and saying, no, you can't do that. You're not we took an Uber to the hospital because EMS wouldn't take us in the ambulance.
Yeah.
We took an Uber.
Yeah, that's important to know, because and that, I mean, that is a risk. But if you really want to choose the hospital that you go to, EMS by law has to take you to the closest hospital. So yeah, you do have to have your own transportation if you choose to go elsewhere. Yeah. So Meety, we talked about ventilators. And as far as COVID goes, what treatments have you seen that have been making a difference that families should be asking for?
I'm sure we all heard of remdesivir, which is one of the medications that they have started to give to patients. And Dr. Mill, I myself contracted COVID back in January, unfortunately, and something that I participated in, which is something that they're doing now, is the convalescent plasma to limit the coronavirus associated complications. And so basically what that is, if your family member or loved one is so impacted by the virus, what they can do is they will give them a plasma transfusion of someone who already had the virus, who now has developed the antibodies. And I'm sure you know this, but for the listening audience, the antibodies also helps you to fight off other diseases or germs that are in your body, that once your body has recognized them. So if you are receiving a plasma transfusion, that will help to, again, limit the complications and or reduce the complications that one might have. The new one, and
I want to put a pin in there because I really want to underscore what you're saying and make it really clear that you can get that plasma before you actually get sick. That's when it helps the most. Correct. And it's for people who are older than 65, and people who have underlying conditions. So if you get diagnosed with COVID and you're obese, you have a heart condition, you have a lung condition, you have a kidney condition, even if you feel perfectly fine, invest the 3 hours that it takes to infuse that plasma, because it will keep you out of the hospital. Black people and other minorities are not getting that treatment. And I'm so glad that you brought it up, Nurse Meety, because we need to get that information out there.
Yes, and we shouldn't be afraid of it. We get plasma transfusion, and quite frankly, Charles Drew is a Black physician out here from DC years and years ago from Howard University, which pioneered that whole ability for us to have, blood and plasma transfusions. So yes, to your point, Dr. Mel, we need to make sure we're asking and advocating for ourselves and or our family members. And the new, not so new, Dr. Mel, but something recently within the last few months, probably since the end of the summer, early fall, is proning. And so people need to understand, and you all can just imagine, and if you all can see me, if I'm just leaning back in my chair and I drink something or I swallow something, it's way more difficult for that to go down into my lungs. And I have a little glass of water, a cup of water here. If I drink that, it's easier to go down your esophagus, and that way you don't cough or regurgitate something that may go into your lungs. So what we do in the hospital setting now, and this is more so for individuals if they are on a ventilator, we prone them, meaning that we have them lay on their stomach. And so that way the mucus buildup that occurs from COVID, which is ultimately how the patient succumbs from a significant respiratory issue. Oh, can you see me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, great. Which is ultimately how patients from a respiratory perspective succumb, is that there's so much buildup in your lungs, and your lungs are like a sponge. And so once that sponge is so filled, then you have to be able to get rid of and release extra fluid and mucus and that buildup, so you're able to do it. So if we put you on your stomach, and that really comes from it's a highly acute, necessary process that takes, a lot of nurses. It takes physical therapists to be able to do that. I'm hearing some background, I'm sorry. And it takes a whole team of individuals to prone a patient. So that is something that you should be asking for, advocating on behalf of your family member. Prayerfully, they are not intubated, but if they are, definitely make sure you ask for that.
Yes, and that actually can even help keep people from getting onto the ventilator, as well as there are other things short of being on the ventilator, like BiPAP, which is like that mask that blows air into your body. So there are a lot of things that we now know that we didn't know back in March. Yeah. So Sharon, I want to get one more question in before we bring our producers on with you. So, as the caregiver, you talked about when Thurston came home and you had to work with that oxygen and learn that. How did you sort of renew yourself and deal with this whole emotional toll of what he was going through, and manage all these different things once he was home?
Well, actually, my personality is that I became hyper vigilant with cleaning the house and sanitizing and trying to make sure he had meals. Basically, I am a prayer warrior, so I did a lot of prayer, a lot of meditation. I made sure that I took, I have a tonic that I take that I put together, a concoction, which actually they turned into a pill. I was taking elderberry, vitamin D, zinc. I was taking B12, garlic, and that was a concoction I had put together because before we knew he had it, we were sleeping in the same bed. So I just kept rejuvenating myself with, proper meals. I made sure, even though I got up in the middle of the night to check if he was breathing, because he was on oxygen for a month. And we had to find ways of living separately in the same house, and he was still, considered contaminated, infected.
Yeah,
But
that sounds like it was very stressful.
Yes, and then as time went by, I saw that he was managing and he was getting better, and he was having teledoctor visits every day. And I stood in on that. I made sure that I took down all the information and asked the doctor all the questions to ease my level of stress. And the nurse called in every morning to get his vitals, and I made sure that I wrote that down just in case things were either going up or down. So I
think it's really key. Yeah. No, I think all those things are wonderful, and I think it's really key how well you stayed organized and on top of things, because and thank you so much for describing how sick he was when he came home, because I think that was probably a function of where we were in the pandemic. That there were not enough spaces in rehab for him to go, because it's unusual to send people home on oxygen who were not on oxygen before they came in the hospital, right? It's very unusual to send someone home on oxygen for the first time. So hats off to you, because he sounds like he was sick enough to have gone to rehab. And then last question for Nurse Bartonelli. you know, I talked about, you know, or Sharon talked about things that she did to sort of stay healthy. You know, we know that this pandemic has taken a tremendous toll on healthcare workers. How do you keep the morale of your staff up? And how does that, when their morale is low, how does that affect their ability to advocate for their own patients?
So thank you, Dr. Mel. I do just want to, if I may, take 20 seconds. I want to make sure individuals, like Sharon was saying, please know that elderberry and all of those other things are absolutely wonderful, but we need to know those when you come into the hospital. Those are still supplements that we need to make sure, because other medications can have a reaction to some of those. And so I just want to make sure that the listeners are there. And as a nurse, I would be remiss to not say we typically are the ones that do what we call a medication reconciliation. So please make sure that those home medications and home therapies that you're taking, please still make sure, you know, use your phone, put them in your notes section, because sometimes we forget. Share that with, you know, if you have an older family member or your husband, in your case, Sharon,
This is true.
sharing that list. So when you are admitted and you are distressed, that you have easy access to that. And we all have our phones, as we know. So just make sure you do that. As it relates to caregiver and keeping our own morale up, Dr. Mel, myself, I was actively training for the Chicago Marathon last year, and obviously it was canceled, but I continued to still run, because what I did say to myself is, Lord forbid, if I do get it, I want my lungs to be in the best health that they can possibly be as a 45-year-old. And so I've continued to encourage myself to walk and to run and to still be healthy, and use my own individual platforms to share that with others. The team, quite frankly, Dr. Mel, all of us are tired. I don't really have a nice feel good, you know, story, just to simply say that over the past year, I can speak to my own specific scenario. I received over $6,000 in personal funds. You alluded to being a member of Delta, and my Jack and Jill moms and my church family. Shout out to New Bethel Baptist Church in DC and others, and just friends of mine from Howard University, where I went to undergrad, that literally sent money and just wanted to feed the caregivers that were there every single day working this pandemic. And so just for them to know that people were, you know, were caring and concerned and thankful, definitely kept our morale up. And I will say, now that we're a year into it, I think pandemic fatigue is sitting in, quite frankly. There is caregiver fatigue, and we have to continue. People like myself and others that are leaders, we have to find ways to keep our staff engaged, to continue to show gratitude and thanks to them, because as we all know, there's probably none of us that don't have a family member and or ourselves that have been impacted either by sickness and or from COVID at this point.
They're absolutely true. And you know, we have been having such a great conversation we have questions from the audience, and I've been hogging up all the time. So
we definitely have questions.
Yeah, let's roll with some audience questions.
Lila, do you have a question over there?
I do. I have a question from Angela Mays, who actually had a birthday yesterday. Shout out, happy birthday, Miss Angela. This is for Nurse Meady and or Dr. Mel. Is it appropriate to bring a list of questions or have a list of questions when calling the hospital? Second parter, is there a basic list of questions if it's not COVID related? You know, if it's just a hospital stay that has nothing to do with COVID, what kinds of questions are appropriate to ask?
I'll let you take the first one, and I'll take the second one, Nurse Meady.
The very first thing I would say is get a clear understanding of what the diagnosis is, COVID or not.
Right.
What is my mother, father, sister, brother's diagnosis? Number two, who is the actual attending physician? Right? Because if you're going to a teaching facility, there's a cadre of individuals caring for your family member. So is it Dr. Mel who's the actual attending, or are you speaking to Meady, the resident? So it's important to know who is the captain of the ship, because there's many people on the ship caring and getting it, caring for your caregiver. The second one is, I advise everybody, I'm almost sure probably 99.9% of every hospital in the US has a change of shift either between 6:30 and 7:30 in the morning. Make sure you wake up and make sure you call around 8 o'clock to say, hey, Dr. Meady left. who is the nurse caring for your family member? And can I please speak to that nurse? Hi, nurse. I'm, Angela. Can you tell me how my mother or father is doing today? And let them know that you, as Dr. Mel alluded to a while ago, squeaky wheel gets the oil. So they know that you have a name. And I implore all of you, either use phone, make sure you get a pad, as Sharon would allude to, write everything down. Write down the time that you can share. And I know my friend Wayne is there as our producer. I do want to give a 20-second true story. My husband had a friend, Dr. Mel, whose family member had COVID, his mother. He's here. Mother's in Texas. Do you know that his mother was intubated for a day and a half before he was notified?
Wow.
And so,
I believe it. I believe it. That's terrible. He called my husband, and I'm like, that should have never happened. Did you get a call? Did you get a voicemail? Did anyone contact you? He was like, no. And I was like, this is what you need to do. Get the name of the doctor and get the name of that nursing director, not the charge nurse, the director for that unit, and speak to them. And he called with me on the phone, and I acted as an advocate and asked the subsequent questions. So that is happening. And that's COVID or non-COVID, quite frankly. But make sure you are finding out who's attending and speak and find out the name of the individuals who are caring for your family member. So Nurse Media, I just want to jump in and say also too that ask specifically what the diagnosis is and find out each day what are the milestones that your loved one needs to meet, and what are the criteria that they're using to say that he or she is either getting better or getting worse,
better or worse.
And what are the criteria for getting discharged, and when do you think they will get discharged? And every day ask them those same criteria. What is their pulse ox? What is their heart rate? And know what the best is. Does it need to be under 95%? Does their temperature need to be under 99? Find out exactly what the criteria are and hold them to it every day. Because that way they will keep on top. There we go. We got a witness. Any other questions?
Yes, we have a great deal of questions. So we're in the lightning round right now. So we have a question from Andre Martin. Is there any news on diabetic people being able to take the vaccination shots? I think Dr. Mel.
Yes. People with diabetes and other underlying chronic conditions can take the vaccines. All three that are currently approved work well. Even if you have, I'm sorry?
I said they should be first in line.
Yes, they should be first in line because those individuals need the most protection. And so most places across the country, you're eligible if you have a chronic condition.
From Marsha King, we have, what is the name of the plasma?
So there are two types of plasma. There's convalescent plasma that Nurse Meady talked about, which comes from people who've had COVID. And then there's the kind that they make in the lab, which is what the previous president received, called monoclonal antibodies. But they're essentially the same thing. One comes from real life people, one comes from the lab.
Okay. We have a question from, and I just lost it. And there you go. It's been that kind of day.
All right. I have a question.
Go ahead.
From Tanya Green in Los Angeles. Are organizations like, for example, doctors.com, a good resource during COVID versus going to an urgent care in person or a hospital?
So it really depends, I think. And if I know what you're talking about, that's a house call service.
Correct. Right.
Yeah. So those are sort of relatively new. There are a crop of them that are coming up across the country. Make sure that, check them out on Yelp. Make sure that they're legit before you let them into your house. I still think the safer way is to go with a brick and mortar established practice. But, there are going to be some instances where, your loved one can't get out, and it will be more convenient to do that. And then there are also the telehealth services like Teledoc. So we have a lot of range of things to choose from. But if you're showing signs of things like shortness of breath or chest pain or uncontrolled vomiting or persistent high fever, go to the emergency room. Don't pass go. Don't collect $200.
Get your butt
immediately.
Okay. Here we go from Greer Garland Massey. Good evening, ladies. Dr. Mel, please repeat the hospital rating information. I was never aware of that.
Medicare.gov. And it's called the star ratings. And you just put in your zip code. You can find the hospitals closest to you, or you could even look up the name of a hospital, and you can see how it rates compared to other hospitals in your area.
Okay. And one more from Michelle Walker Scales. Is it best or even possible to avoid the ventilator? I heard other countries had better survival rates because they weren't so quick to put people on ventilators.
Well, if I could just share with that in my experience from seeing patients, it really just depends on your actual clinical presentation. The doctors never initially go straight to the ventilator. They will try supplemental oxygen. They'll try, the BiPAP, as Dr. Clarke alluded to. But if your oxygenation saturations are not where they're supposed to be, if you have very labored breathing, they want to really preserve your lung function as much as possible. And hopefully in tandem, they will also do those other things like remdesivir, the convalescent plasma, the different things that she was speaking about. And Wayne, if I can also add, there's also Leapfrog, which also is another site that serves to talk about the hospital safety ratings. And that's Leapfrog. And you can type that into any search engine, and you can type in again Leapfrog hospital safety, and it will give you ratings, and it rates you the hospitals from an A to an F.
That's great information. Thanks, Nurse Meady.
Yeah.
And also to, as she said, the goal is to keep you alive. And initially, again, at the beginning of the pandemic, there were a lot of things that we didn't understand about what was happening in the lungs and when the right time was to put someone on a ventilator. We have a year's worth of experience now. And so when people get put on the ventilator, it's the best thing for them, and they know exactly how to manage, the person's lung settings on the ventilator. It's not a death sentence to go on a ventilator. We heard from one of our previous guests 2 weeks ago. He fought getting on the ventilator, and his wife and a dear medical friend of his convinced him, look, this is the best thing for you. And he's here with us today because he made the choice to go on the ventilator. So it's a lot that we know now we didn't know before.
Okay. That is going to wrap us.
All right. Well,
throw back to
wow, this was a lightning round for sure. Sharon, Nurse Meady, this was wonderful. You all were both wealth of information. Sharon, thank you so much for opening up and telling us your story. And Nurse Meady, same for your story about having COVID as well. I think when we hear these personal accounts, it's so impactful. And I know my audience is very appreciative of what you've shared. I want to thank everybody this week for tuning in, for giving us those great questions. Yes.
Can I just please remind everyone watching that even if you had COVID and you recovered, such as myself, I try to use any platform that I have, please still follow back up with your physician post your recovery. I shared with you before the show, I now have hypertension post that, and I was perfectly healthy, no medications before COVID. So there is such a thing called post-COVID syndrome that physicians are now sharing with us as we now been in this pandemic for over a year. Even once you have recovered, please go make that appointment with Dr. Mel. Please go make that appointment with your NP, your nurse practitioner, or your actual provider. Do not be afraid. We now know how to make sure things are clean and disinfected appropriately. We all have the appropriate PPE. Please follow back up. It's been a year. So if you haven't gotten that colonoscopy, if you haven't gotten that mammogram, if you haven't gotten your blood checked, if you haven't gotten your diabetes checked, please, 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 I implore you to make sure you reach out to your medical provider to make sure you are taking care of yourself.
You are right on time. Thank you so much for that reminder. That is so key. And also, if you've had COVID, get vaccinated 90 days after and continue to wear your mask, social distance, wash your hands. The variants are out there. I want to thank everybody for tuning in and making sure that, you got your questions answered. Please come back next week we will be here. We're going to have a really special guest next week. So I hope you can tune in. You'll get the sneak peek as we go through the week. And then if you can catch me tomorrow morning, I'll be on the Russ Parr Morning Show at 8:50 a.m. And as I sign off every week and say, remember, be wise, be well, and be health empowered.